Hello, world politics students. How are you doing? Today, we're going to continue to discuss international organizations, but we're going to move on and talk about intergovernmental organizations. So this is the second part of the international organization set of lectures. So intergovernmental organizations, just like NGOs, IGOs have been growing rapidly as well. And this graph from your book demonstrates this, shows this. There's a couple ways to think about this growth across the world in IGOs. First, to put it in perspective, think how rapidly states have grown over the course of the 20th century into this century. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were roughly about 40 states in the world. With the end of colonialism, with some self-determination movements and some independence movements, we now have roughly 200 states in the world. So it's a growth of about 4 times over this period, over the past century and 20 years. Now compare that to the growth of intergovernmental organizations. They've grown almost 9 times over the course of the 20th century into the early 21st century. At the time of the First World War, there were about 50, actually fewer than 50, intergovernmental organizations on the world stage. Today, and before the end of the 20th century, there were almost 350. So while states have grown 5 times, IGOs have grown 9 times, a much more rapid pace of growth. Another way to think about it, so they're just growing much more common and becoming much more prevalent in comparison to the growth of states. Another way to think about it is to think about the age of IGOs. So one author looks at the 150 most influential IGOs, according to him, in the world, and he looks at their average age. And their average age is only 36 years old. That's only 2 years younger than the average age of an American citizen, about 38 years old. So compare that, 36 years old, to the United States. We're almost 240 years old. Think about some European states or China and Japan, other countries such as this, nation states or multinational states. They are centuries old. So IGOs are really new actors on the world stage in the broad sweep of things, when you take a broader perspective. They're youthful actors on the world stage. So we really don't know what their full impact will be as time goes on. And there are different perspectives on this. And this is underlined even more when we talk about functionalism later today, because even those that exist have grown to take on more important roles over time. And we'll discuss that. So states form IGOs today really for the same reasons they did a century and a half ago. They do it when problems arise that are difficult for them to handle alone, problems that spill across borders or that they can't handle on their own because the issues aren't constrained by borders. And they determine that it'd be more efficient to handle these problems with collaboration. The first impulse of states, if you go back and trace the birth of different IGOs, the first impulse isn't to create an IGO. It's only when a problem is ongoing and really problematic that states will create, sign on, and fund an IGO. They prefer to have a treaty to resolve whatever issue they're dealing with They prefer ad hoc arrangements, just arrangements that are superficial and aren't meant to last. And the reason is IGOs cost money and they can constrain states. So think about it. IGOs are brick and mortar institutions. They're actual bodies, institutional bodies with personnel in them. And those personnel cost money. So states have to help, states who sign on to the IGOs have to help support financially these institutions. And more than that, once a brick and mortar institution is created and it's staffed with all these personnel whose job it is to fulfill the functions of the IGO, they could potentially constrain states, the states that created them, because their whole purpose, the whole purpose of the IGO is to monitor and perhaps take action on some issue in world affairs. Because states don't want their freedom of action restrained, and think about it, if you have power and you're responsible for your population, you don't want limits on your power. Historically, they've created very narrow, well-defined IGOs, focusing on what your book calls technical or functional, dealing with some certain function, some specific type of interaction between states, issues, some narrow technical functional issues. And these tend to be low politics issues. If you remember back to our discussion of realism, these are issues which distinguish between low politics and high politics. These are issues dealing with social affairs or economic affairs. They aren't high politics issues dealing with peace or war or stability of countries. So the very first IGOs created were these kind of technical institutions. The very first IGO was something called the Central Committee for the Navigation of the Rhine. It was created in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars. And the whole purpose was to prevent states from going to war, from fighting over this artery, this waterway, which trade flowed through, to have access to the Rhine River. So they needed to coordinate, they needed a body to solve disputes amongst them so that they could all use this waterway peacefully without coming to blows. Universal Postal Union is also old. You know, narrow technical functional issue. Let's distribute mail across countries and let's accept the stamps and the various means of sharing this mail across different borders. And there are all sorts of examples of IGOs that are narrow and very technical or dealing with specific low politics issues. Some are important. The International Monetary Fund, we'll talk about later, you'll read about later. It's a major world organization funded largely by countries in the first tier that steps in when countries have financial difficulties or in the midst of economic crises. Because the fear is those economic crises could spill across borders and create greater instability. The IMF has given loans to first-tier countries. The United Kingdom or Great Britain took out an IMF loan in the 1970s when they were having tremendous economic difficulties. But again, the purpose of the IGO, the mission, what it's allowed to do is narrow and well-defined. Steps in when countries have economic crises with loans. There are a range of other narrow, well-defined IGOs. There's something called the International Red Locust Control Organization for Central and Southern Africa. It sounds silly or trivial, but actually locust plagues can be devastating to agriculture and thus subsistence and the ability to feed yourself within African countries. And locusts don't care about national borders. They don't care about whether this is Kenya or Rwanda or whichever countries it happens to be, Uganda. They disregard borders. In order to control them, you can't control them only within your border. You have to coordinate with other states. And that's what this organization does. Small, technical, functional issue. There's another one called the Union of Banana Exporting Countries. Again, Latin American countries that have worked together for banana growing, sharing banana growing information, and coordinating how they export their Chiquita or Dole bananas to the rest of the world. It's in their interest to cooperate on this. So they created this international organization, this IGO, International Intergovernmental Organization. It was only really in the 20th century that multi-purpose IGOs came into being that dealt with a whole range of issues, including the big issues of war and peace. We've already talked about the League of Nations after the First World War. We've talked about the United Nations. You'll read more about it and we'll talk more about it. But there are other examples, regional examples, the Organization of American States, the African Union, which used to be the Organization of African Unity. These are broad IGOs that deal with a whole host of issues. States create them to try to resolve these issues that don't respect borders, that impact multiple states in the region or around the world. What's interesting about IGOs, including some of these broader based IGOs, is that sometimes they evolve to take on more and more responsibility and more issues. And sometimes they evolve from low politics issues, say social issues, economic trade issues, to high politics issues. A great example is something called ECOWAS. This is the Economic Community of West African States. It was established to promote free trade and cooperation among states in this part of the world, just in West Africa, because it's long been proven, economists continually argue, that states with more open borders and freer trade grow more rapidly in absolute terms. They tend to benefit from free trade. And you'll read about this further later in the semester. The interesting thing is, when civil war broke out in two different countries in West Africa, first Liberia, which has historic ties to the United States and was not colonized, and then Sierra Leone, which has historic ties to Britain, ECOWAS transformed into a military organization. ECOWAS created interventionary forces, peacekeeping forces, under the banner, under the organization they created called ECOMOG, which doesn't make sense. It's the ECOWAS Monitoring Group, is what the acronym stands for. But they actually sent, again, it was just a free trade organization. They meet and discuss ways to open their borders more, have greater efficiency in their trade. Suddenly, when refugees were spilling out from the civil war within their region, and the countries involved were troubled by all the instability and chaos, they transformed into a military organization. And they sent troops, a lot of mainly Nigerian troops, because Nigeria is the most populous and most economically powerful country in the region. but they sent troops to Liberia and then later to Sierra Leone. And they had some success in helping to foster stability within these countries. Interestingly, and we're going to stick on ECOMOG and ECOWAS right now. Interestingly, they didn't initially have success until they had to hire an NGO, a non-governmental organization, to come in and fight the civil war for them to create stability within these countries. And they hired a NGO called Executive Outcomes. It's an NGO, it's a mercenary outfit. These are mercenaries for hire that come in and handle military issues, instability for countries around the world, really. It's a South African outfit. It went defunct in 1998. In 2020, it was reformed and continues to take on these mercenary missions when governments or other actors pay them around the world. They're not the only mercenary outfit. There are many. There's something called the Wagner Group, which is mainly Russian in origin and is involved in Libya and Syria, and Central African Republic. There are a range of others. Blackwater, you may have heard of. The United States used a number of these private military organizations where we paid them in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. So anyway, what's interesting about this in terms of talking about international organizations is that this is at first a very narrow IGO. ECOWAS transformed itself into a broader based IGO dealing with matters of war and peace, dealing with military intervention into other countries, sending troops in other countries. And they had to hire an NGO, a mercenary outfit out of South Africa, Executive Outcomes, to come in and help to stabilize the state. IGO hiring an NGO to come in and help to stabilize civil war prone, chaotic states. And Executive Outcomes had a good deal of success. ECOWAS is a very good example of what's called functionalism. Functionalism is a theory, it's an idea about international organizations, especially IGOs, that argues that incrementally, slowly, in a step-by-step fashion, IGOs' responsibilities grow over time. And with those responsibilities and their growth, they become more powerful. And why is that? This argument dates back 70 years. The argument is, as states cooperate in narrow, well-defined areas, like mail, internet hookups between nations, other technical areas, and they see that cooperation is successful, they will start to cooperate on other issues. And cooperation being successful, I'll define it as beneficial to that state that's operating within this IGO. They start to cooperate on other issues. So it spills over, cooperation spills over, and IGOs remit and their power slowly grows. That's what happened with ECOWAS when it became ECOMOG. Another example is the European Union. The European Union started almost 70 years ago, something called the European Coal and Steel Community. And its whole purpose was to put coal and steel under cooperative control between mainly France and Germany, on the border between France and Germany, which was a heavily industrialized area. Under cooperative international control, because coal and steel were considered the key ingredients for war-making abilities. And the thought was that these were under international and not national control, and not all international, but the countries that were involved in the coal and steel community. If it was under cooperative control, then individual countries couldn't use these industrial products for war. And Europe had been racked by war for centuries. So if they coordinated and removed national control from these crucial products, there would no longer be war on the European continent. The coal and steel community gradually grew, took on greater responsibility, became the European Economic Community, fostering free trade within its borders for the same reasons that ECOWAS was created, for greater economic growth. It evolved into the European Union, which not only had free trade, but had free movement of people, of labor across different countries. Again, all for greater economic growth, and also coordinated a common foreign policy, at least on certain issues, especially trade issues. On trade issues, the EU is largely a single bloc. So it started off as this coal and steel community, became a free trade area that eventually allowed the free movement of people and labor across borders, to the point that it has a common economic policy to the outside world. And now, over the past couple decades, just like ECOWAS, the European Union deploys military forces. This is functionalism. Cooperation in one area spills over. And eventually these international organizations take more and more power in terms of what they're able to do on the world stage and the types of things that states give them responsibility for. So the European Union sent in troops, not German troops, not French troops, not Italian troops, not Spanish troops, sent in European Union troops in the early 2000s in Congo, first when a UN mission in Eastern Congo collapsed and there was instability, the EU sent in a force that created stability in that part of the country. And then when there were elections within Congo, they oversaw the elections within the capital city, Kinshasa, and stabilized so that there were free and fair elections, and the country went through this transition. It had never been democratic. Went through this transition to a more democratic future. This is an international organization, the IGO, doing this, sending troops into another country. Never could have imagined this. Other than the UN, never could have imagined this from the European Union in the past. They've sent in multiple military missions since that time. I'm going to skip past the slide quickly. So here's from 2020, European Union missions. It shows all the different missions going on, either monitoring missions with civilians monitoring or helping with police forces, or look at this, in 2020, 6 ongoing military operations. So something that began as just a control over 2 specific industries to prevent warfare in the future evolved into a free trade area. Now, here's the European force for the Republic of Congo. I talked about those early military interventions by the European Union. Now, actually has a military force, and a frequently used military force. An ongoing one constantly is Atalanta. It's a European Union naval presence off the coast of Somalia to guard against piracy. And they've actually landed and used force on the Somalian land, on Somalian soil. So this is a IGO using military force. Again, functionalism. IGOs start off in narrow technical areas. When cooperation succeeds, it benefits states. States cooperate, the role of the IGOs expands. So that now, with the EU and with ECOMOG and other examples, IGOs that began with low politics, technical issues have grown to become military units. So again, we talk about tangents in this class. Mental break, just to give you a little breathing room. If we were in a lecture hall, you'd be able to put down your pencils, relax just for a minute. So I want to talk about a tangent about mercenaries in Africa, because we just talked about executive outcomes, the South African mercenary outfit that actually really did stabilize West African states. And they were hired, an NGO hired by an IGO. The king of mercenaries in Africa, again, mercenaries would be a non-government organization. The king of mercenaries, which is one of the titles given to him, and also another title is Nightmare of Presidents, is a man named Bob Denard. He's a famous, infamous, now deceased French mercenary. This is a French magazine, a book, excuse me, called Pirate of the Republic. And Corsair is also an English word for pirate. And of the Republic just means speaking of French. So basically French pirate book about Bob Denard. What's interesting about him is that he actually led numerous coups within Africa in the 80s, 90s, 70s, 60s. But he actually took control of countries. Famously, he took control of Comoros, the Comoros Islands, twice. The first time with fewer than 50 men, but well-trained, well-armed European soldiers who came in and briefly took control of the Comoros Islands. In the late 80s, a French military operation came in, removed him, he surrendered, took him back to France, he stood trial, he committed no crimes on French soil, he was let go. Eventually, later in the 90s, he again took control with 33 men of the Comoros. Can you imagine? Again, this is an NGO taking control of a state with just a band of mercenaries. So again, we talk about realism and states being the center of power and states being the only truly important entities in world affairs. This is an NGO taking over a state. And again, even in the 90s, the French intervened, ousted Denard, took him back to France. He stood trial. He was in prison for a while. But why? The reasons, again, some of this is murky, but what's he going to do? He's going to say, suddenly it's the Republic of Bob. I am the country. Here it is. I'm the country of Bob Denard. But this is an NGO taking over a state. There's a couple movies made about Bob Denard in French. There are other famous mercenaries. The movie Wild Geese is about an Irish, he was in the British Army, but an Irish mercenary named Mike Hoare. But again, this notion of states being extremely powerful and sovereign always is fluid when you think about executive outcomes and you think about Bob Denard and his frequent mercenary missions and taking over countries. It's fluid. So where does this all lead? What conclusions can we provide about IGOs? Well, that's difficult. So realist critics would say functionalism is flawed. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, these IGOs may take on more and more responsibility, but states won't let them have too much power. States won't let them have power over their own security when push comes to shove. So the European Union may have a military force that deploys in other parts of the world for peacekeeping, or actually peacemaking, actually fighting. But that military force is tiny in comparison and very weak in comparison to, say, the French military force, which is still a national force, or the German, or the Italian. These countries still have their own national military forces because ultimately, at the end of the day, they rely on their national militaries for their people's security and for their country's security. In terms of what it all means, one perspective is this realist perspective, that IGOs can never become that powerful. They may be increasing in importance, but there are few signs that they're really edging states from the center of world affairs, especially powerful states. They play a much more potent role, a much more influential role in less powerful or developing states. And when you think about how hesitant states are to create IGOs, and they prefer treaties or ad hoc arrangements, that also supports the realist point of view. Crises also support the realist point of view. So think about the European Union, one of the most successful IGOs in history. Economically successful, has a common foreign policy on trade issues, has deployed military troops and ongoing missions in different parts of the world to the benefit of either the countries they deploy them to or to the benefit of the European Union, of European countries, like allowing free trade to continue to flow off the coast of Somalia. Goods from Asia flowing freely to Europe. So the EU has a role in that area. But when crises come, states still, from the realist point of view, even in the European Union, look out for number one. So what examples do we have? One example is, think about the immigrant crisis coming from Syria over the past decade or so. Syrian civil war has generated millions of immigrants to different European Union countries, or different European countries. And what do European countries do? So they close their borders, even to other European Union countries. Hungary, which is no longer really a democracy, but Hungary has built physical border walls with Croatia. They're planning to build one with Romania. They built one with Serbia, which has been voted to ascend to the European Union, but isn't formally admitted yet. So when push comes to shove and they face crisis, the Hungarian government is looking out for their population, looking out for number one, building borders despite the fact it's supposed to be a free trade area with free movement of labor, people flowing freely across borders for economic benefit, building actual physical borders. Another example is the pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic. Again, European countries, despite the fact the EU exists, closed borders, limited international travel to try to contain the pandemic and to secure their population first and foremost. And there was also even competition between different European countries in terms of the development of a vaccine. The French really pushed hard to develop a vaccine, but it was a German startup along with Pfizer that developed the very first successful vaccine. So from that realist perspective, IGOs can never be that powerful, even though they are more prevalent and are fulfilling larger functions on the world stage. So your book hints at really a different perspective, though, which would be more of a liberal perspective. And actually, a lot of realists buy into this as well. And that is when you think about the cumulative effect of IGOs, they may be changing world affairs. They may be having an impact, even though they're young. They haven't been on the world stage for a long time. So think about it. If states are cooperating on all these areas where they really have to cooperate, and call them interdependencies, where issues spill across borders and they have to cooperate to succeed. And there are more and more of them, and more IGOs are being created. The argument is, from this perspective, the liberal perspective, that these build up over time. All these areas add up, and that changes the way states interact with one another. So think about, again, the realist argument from earlier in the semester. For realists, states are the only game in town. At the end of the day, they're the only game in town. So the image you could have is like a pool table, and states are billiard balls. They're the only things that matter. The green felt, nothing constrains them. When one state collides into another in conflict or whatever, there's nothing else there. There's green felt, smooth rolling, because states are it. Well, from this other perspective, all these different linkages, all these different ties with IGOs, not to mention NGOs, but with IGOs, it's like states are enmeshed in webs of constraint on a whole host of issues. It's like these billiard balls have spider webs, but entities more powerful, a substance more powerful than just spider webs, holding them together on a whole range of issues which they don't want to break because it's beneficial. And the argument is, over time, this changes world affairs, especially as IGOs grow and take on more and more responsibilities to the point that they're deploying forces around the world. I don't have the answer to this debate. We're going to have to see. I think both really have kernels of truth. Both are correct. States are the ultimate repositories of power and economic military might at the end of the day. But they are constrained on more and more issues through IGOs. And IGOs have grown more powerful over time and spilled over into more weighty, influential issues. So we'll just have to see as the world moves forward. So IGO growth, IGOs transforming the world as we move forward. We'll talk about different issues next time. Thank you again.